In the heart of a nation divided by war, a single document promised to reshape the destiny of millions. On January 1, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, a bold declaration that all enslaved people in the Confederate States shall be thenceforward, and forever free. It was a turning point in American history, a moment meant to end centuries of bondage and ignite the dawn of true liberty. But the promise of freedom, like light breaking through a storm, did not reach everyone at once. Across the deep South, especially in the far reaches of Texas, the news of liberation traveled slowly, for over 2 long years after Lincoln's decree. Thousands of men, women, and children continued to toil in the cotton fields, unaware that their lives had already been transformed on paper. Why did freedom take so long to arrive? Part of the answer lies in geography and defiance. Texas, isolated and vast, was the last stronghold of the Confederacy. Union troops were scarce, and local authorities, along with plantation owners, had every reason to keep the truth hidden. To them, the end of slavery meant the end of power, profit, and control, and so, silence became their weapon. Meanwhile, the Civil War raged on. Cities burned, families were torn apart, and the nation bled itself dry in the struggle to decide who counted as free. Lincoln's words carried the moral weight of justice, but without enforcement. They were fragile promises written in ink, not yet carved into reality. As 1865 dawned, the Confederacy lay in ruins. Lincoln was gone, the war was over, yet freedom still had one final journey to make, a journey westward, across rivers and plains, to the people who had waited unknowingly in bondage for 2 more seasons of harvest. And then, on June 19, 1860, in the port city of Galveston, Texas, that promise finally arrived. A Union general stepped onto Texas soil with an announcement that would change everything. All slaves are free. That day would become known as Juneteenth, the day freedom finally touched every corner of America. But what came next was not celebration alone. The story of Juneteenth is not just about liberation, it is about resilience, rebuilding, and redefining what freedom truly means. So stay with us as we uncover the real story behind Juneteenth, America's true Independence Day. If you believe that history still has lessons to teach us, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who values truth and remembrance. Because understanding where freedom came from is how we protect it today. As Lincoln's words of freedom echoed through the war-torn nation, they moved like a rising tide, unstoppable in spirit, but slowed by distance, resistance, and fear, while Union armies swept across the East and South, liberating cities one by one. There was one vast frontier where the tide of change could not yet reach. That place was Texas, the farthest edge of the Confederacy, wild and distant, where the old world clung to life even as the rest of the South began to crumble. To many enslavers fleeing the advancing Union forces, Texas became a kind of last refuge, a sanctuary for the dying institution of slavery. The state's isolation made it perfect for secrecy and control. Its immense size, sparse population, and the absence of a strong Union military presence allowed those who refused to accept defeat to continue their old ways unchecked. In the final years of the Civil War, as Confederate strongholds fell one after another, Texas became a magnet for those determined to hold on to the past. Caravans of wagons crossed muddy roads, and steamboats pushed upriver loaded with people who had no choice in their journey. Families torn from Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas were marched hundreds of miles westward. They did not know why they were being moved. Some believed it was a transfer of ownership. Others whispered that the war had ended, but that their masters did not want them to find out. Behind the fade of calm plantations, Texas was becoming the Confederacy's final hiding place, a land where the truth could be buried under the weight of silence. For the plantation owners, Texas was more than geography, it was a chance to preserve power. With the federal government focused on rebuilding and military campaigns elsewhere, the western frontier seemed beyond the reach of emancipation. The fields stretched endlessly, and cotton still promised profit. The enslaved people brought there continued to work under the sun, their labor feeding a dream that should have already died. Many of the white settlers convinced themselves that Texas would remain untouched, that even if the Confederacy fell, this distant land could exist as a new beginning for their lost cause. The war was ending, but in Texas it felt like time stood still. The newspapers carried no truth, and letters from the East were filtered through loyal eyes. In the towns and fields, no one spoke openly about the Emancipation Proclamation. It was as if the words had never been written. For those who lived in bondage, hope was something fragile, whispered in the night like a rumor from another world. Stories of liberation drifted westward, but they arrived without proof. No soldiers, no flags, no voices of authority, only faint echoes of a freedom that seemed too distant to believe in. Texas' remoteness gave it an eerie calm in those years. While cities like Richmond and Atlanta burned, the fields of Brazoria, Galveston, and Houston remained eerily untouched by the flames of war. The Confederate government, collapsing in chaos, sent its remaining officials to Texas, hoping to regroup. The local leaders took that as permission to continue enforcing their own laws that kept people enslaved long after the rest of the South had surrendered. And so, for more than 2 years after Lincoln's proclamation, Texas lived in a strange limbo, part of a defeated nation but ruled by the ghost of an old order. On the plantations, work continued from dawn to dusk as it always had. Cotton was planted, harvested, and sold. Children were born into servitude that legally no longer existed. To the outside world, the war had ended. To those within Texas' borders, the illusion of slavery persisted as if time had stopped. It was not just silence that kept them bound, it was fear. Plantation owners threatened punishment for anyone who dared to question their status. The few who spoke of freedom were silenced, sometimes violently, and others were too exhausted or cautious to challenge a system that still controlled every part of their lives. The lie of slavery endured not because people believed it was right, but because those in power refused to let go. The irony was haunting. The Confederacy had already fallen. Its armies were disbanded, its leaders captured or in hiding. The United States had declared victory, and the nation was beginning to heal. But in Texas, thousands of people were still trapped in the shadows of a war that was already over. The proclamation existed, but it had no voice here. Freedom had been declared, but it had no messenger. From the distant plantations near the Rio Grande to the bustling port of Galveston, the days blended into months, and the months into years. Men and women continued their labor under the illusion that nothing had changed. Yet deep within the heart of that silence, something was shifting, an invisible tension building toward the inevitable moment when truth would finally arrive. When Union troops at last made their way into Texas in the summer of 1865, they entered a world suspended between the past and the future. They saw fields still worked by the enslaved, plantations still governed by the whip, and a society still pretending that the Confederacy had not fallen. The soldiers carried not just weapons, but a message, one that would end the longest delay of freedom in American history. Texas had served as the final refuge of a crumbling system, a land where denial reigned longer than law. But even there, change was waiting. The wind that carried the Union ships toward Galveston also carried the truth Lincoln had written years before, that no one born under the same sky should live as property of another. And when that truth finally touched Texas soil, it would transform the state that once hid from freedom into the very ground where freedom's last chains were broken. By the spring of 1865, the thunder of cannon fire had finally gone silent. The long and brutal civil war that had divided the nation was over. Cities once burning with conflict now stood in ruins, and weary soldiers began their journey home. But amid this fragile peace, one of the war's greatest promises, the freedom of millions, remained unfulfilled. In Texas, the great frontier where silence had long shielded lies, women and children still bent their backs to the same work, under the same sun, for masters who no longer had the right to own them. The war had ended in April. Richmond, the proud Confederate capital, had fallen. General Robert Lee had surrendered his army to General Ulysses Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The rebellion was finished, its dream of division defeated. And then, just days later, the nation was shaken by tragedy. President Abraham Lincoln, the man whose signature had carried freedom on paper, was gone, struck down by an assassin's hand. The hope that his voice had carried seemed to dim with him. In the confusion that followed, the vast, untouched plains of Texas grew even quieter. The world was changing. But in this distant corner, the echoes of change were still being smothered. Plantation owners and local officials in Texas understood exactly what Lincoln's death and the South's surrender meant: the end of the system that had given them power. But they also understood something else. Information was control. If they could keep the truth from spreading, if they could silence the whisper of emancipation long enough, they could preserve the illusion that nothing had changed. And so, they did. The news of freedom, already delayed by distance, was further buried under layers of deceit. Letters went undelivered, newspapers were hidden, and visiting strangers who mentioned the war's end were watched carefully or turned away. For the enslaved, life went on as it always had. In the cotton fields of East Texas, the rhythm of labor continued sunrise to sunset. 7 days a week, overseers barked orders. The crack of whips echoed through the air, and the endless rows of crops promised wealth for men who no longer legally owned their workers. Some enslaved people sensed that something in the world beyond had shifted. They noticed fewer Confederate soldiers passing through, heard rumors whispered in secret that the war was finished. But without proof, the risk of hope was too dangerous. Hope, in those fields, could still be punished. In towns like Galveston, Houston, and Marshall, the white elite gathered in quiet meetings, deciding how to handle the changing tides. Many feared the arrival of Union troops, not for what they would bring, but for what they would reveal. They knew that the day Federal soldiers set foot in Texas, their carefully constructed lie would collapse. Until then, they kept working their enslaved laborers, pushing for one more harvest, one more season of profit before the inevitable reckoning. The deception was deliberate, cold, and calculated. Some owners went so far as to tell their workers that the Union Army intended to enslave them again if they tried to leave, twisting fear into obedience. Others claimed that Lincoln's proclamation had been overturned when he died. In this world built on manipulation, ignorance was the strongest chain of all. For those who endured the silence, freedom was no longer a distant dream, it was a truth stolen from them in plain sight. Across the rest of the country, Reconstruction had already begun. Formerly enslaved families were reuniting, freedmen's schools were opening, and Union soldiers were establishing order in cities still bearing the scars of war. But in Texas, the calendar seemed stuck in time. The seasons changed, but the world did not. The plantations thrived as if the Confederacy had never fallen. Children were born into bondage that no longer existed in law, yet persisted in practice. The contradiction was staggering. America had declared victory for liberty, but liberty itself had yet to cross the western horizon. There were those in Texas who knew the truth and could no longer bear the weight of it. Union sympathizers, Northern travelers, and even some local ministers tried to spread word of the Emancipation Proclamation. Yet their voices were few, and the power structures around them were strong. The military presence of the United States was thin. with most troops still stationed in the east, focused on rebuilding shattered states. Texas, vast and remote, was left to govern itself for a while longer, a loophole in history that allowed injustice to linger where it should have died. As spring turned to summer in 1865, a strange calm settled over Texas. The war was gone, but the old order still stood. The enslaved woke each morning believing the world remained the same, unaware that the nation's laws had already declared them free men and women. In their hearts, some felt the shift, a quiet restlessness, a sense that something unseen was moving closer. The air itself seemed charged with change, though none could yet name it. And somewhere out on the Gulf Coast, ships bearing Union soldiers were already cutting through the water, their flags snapping in the wind. Among them was a man named General Gordon Granger, carrying with him a piece of paper that would finally give voice to the truth Lincoln had written years before. He did not yet know that the words he carried would rewrite the history of Texas, or that they would spark a celebration that would endure for generations. As those ships approached Galveston's shore, the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the land that had resisted the future. The lie that had held thousands captive for 2 long years was about to end. Freedom was no longer a rumor, nor a promise on parchment. It was coming with the force of truth, unstoppable and alive, carried by men who would make sure it was heard by every soul who had waited too long to believe it. The morning of June 19, 1860, began like any other in Galveston, Texas. The heavy summer air clung to the streets. The harbor shimmered under the sun, and the city moved with the slow rhythm of people who believed the world beyond their horizon no longer concerned them. The war had ended months ago, but in Texas, time had stood still. Merchants opened their shops, planters counted their harvest, and on the plantations beyond the city, men and women worked in silence, unaware that their labor had already been written out of law. But that morning, the horizon changed. Out on the Gulf waters, sails appeared white and distant at first, then growing larger, until Union ships glided into view like ghosts from a different world, bringing with them the truth that had taken 2 long years to arrive. When the soldiers disembarked, the people of Galveston watched in uneasy silence. Union blue had never looked so bright under the Texas sun. At their head rode Major General Gordon Granger, a man whose face carried the wariness of war, but whose mission burned with purpose. He had come not as a conqueror, but as a messenger to deliver a promise that had been written, delayed, and nearly forgotten. The city, still draped in Confederate pride, did not welcome him warmly. Yet there was something inevitable about his arrival, as if history itself had followed him ashore. Granger and his men marched through the streets until they reached the steps of Ashton Villa, a grand mansion that had once been the pride of Galveston's wealthy class. There, before soldiers, townspeople, and the curious onlookers who had gathered to see what the Union intended, he unfolded a single piece of paper. General Order No. 3. His voice carried over the heat and hush of the crowd, measured but unwavering, as he read the words that would change everything. The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The words hung in the air like something too heavy, too vast, to be understood all at once. Some stood frozen, unsure if they had heard correctly. Others whispered to one another in disbelief, afraid to hope that what they had just heard was real. Those who had lived their entire lives under chains felt their hearts rise and falter at the same time. Freedom had come, but it had come so late, so quietly, that it almost felt like a dream. Outside Galveston, the news spread like wind across the fields and bayous. Union soldiers rode from plantation to plantation, reading the order aloud to those who had been kept in ignorance. In some places, they were met with joy cries, tears, and laughter bursting forth from people who had waited generations for this moment. In others, there was confusion, even fear. Freedom was a word too long denied, and now it arrived without instruction or promise of safety. But no matter how it was received, the truth could no longer be contained. The silence that had protected slavery in Texas for 2 years was shattered by a voice of authority that could not be ignored. The planters and local officials who had hidden the truth could do nothing to stop it now. The soldiers' presence made the proclamation more than words on a page. It was law, backed by the power of the United States government. On that day, Texas ceased to be the last stronghold of an old world. Its fields, its homes, its people were now bound to a new beginning. For those who had lived their lives in bondage, the hours that followed were filled with emotions that defied description. Some fell to their knees and prayed. Others sang, their voices trembling with disbelief and joy. A few walked away from the fields without looking back, choosing the open road over the soil that had held their suffering. Yet freedom did not come with clear directions. Many had nowhere to go, no land, no money, no family left to find. Still, the knowledge that they were no longer property, that they were human beings in the eyes of the law, was enough to lift them from despair. In Galveston, that evening, small gatherings began in homes, churches, and open squares. Candles flickered as people recited the words they had heard that day, as if repeating them could make the truth more real. All slaves are free. For the first time, they could claim the right to their own names, their own choices, their own futures. It was not an end, but a beginning, a fragile birth of freedom that would require courage to survive. General Granger remained in Texas for weeks after issuing his order, overseeing the transition and ensuring the message spread across the state. His men faced resistance from those who still clung to the illusion of the Confederacy. But the momentum of history was no longer theirs to control. Across the countryside, the sound of work songs faded, replaced by hymns of deliverance and new beginnings. Each passing day carried the message farther, until even the most remote plantations could no longer deny what had been declared. The 19th of June, 1860, became more than a date. It became a symbol, the day when freedom, after years of delay and deception, reached its last destination. It marked the moment when a nation that had spoken of liberty finally began to live it. Imperfectly but irreversibly. Those who were freed that day carried the memory forward, passing it down through generations, not as a tale of suffering, but as a testament to endurance and faith. As night fell over Galveston, the sound of celebration mingled with the hum of the warm sea air. The soldiers rested, the city slept uneasily, and the newly freed stood under the stars, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring, but certain that tomorrow would be theirs. The promise that had taken 2 years to travel from Washington to Texas had finally arrived. And though the road ahead would be long and painful, that night, on the shores of the Gulf, freedom had a voice, and it could finally be heard. The sound of celebration swept through the humid summer air of Texas as word began to spread. Freedom had finally arrived. For generations, women and children had lived under the crushing weight of bondage. But now, on June 19, 1860, their world shifted forever. The message General Gordon Granger read in Galveston had traveled from ear to ear, whispered from the docks to the fields, until it became a chorus of disbelief and wonder. Many wept, others prayed, and some simply stood in stunned silence, trying to grasp what this newfound freedom truly meant. In that moment, the long shadow of slavery began to lift, replaced by an emotion few had ever dared to feel: hope. That day would come to be known as Juneteenth, a blending of the words June and 19th, and it marked the first time freedom was celebrated as something tangible, something real. Across Texas, spontaneous gatherings took place in open fields, under oak trees, and near river banks. People joined hands, sang spirituals that had carried them through generations of suffering, and offered prayers of gratitude. They wore their best clothing, shared what food they had, and told stories not of sorrow this time, but of triumph. For many, it was the first day they could choose what to do with their own time, the first sunrise they could greet as free people. But Juneteenth was not merely a party. It was a declaration of existence, a statement that even after centuries of cruelty, their spirits had not been broken. Freedom had not been given. It had been earned through unimaginable endurance. Formerly enslaved ministers preached about deliverance. Mothers braided their daughters' hair while telling them they would never be sold away. And fathers taught their sons to walk with dignity, even if the world refused to see their worth. The day became sacred. A second Independence Day, one written not in the halls of Congress, but in the hearts of people who had known the deepest kind of captivity. As the years passed, the tradition continued. Every June 19th, communities gathered again, sometimes in quiet remembrance, sometimes in vibrant parades filled with drums, music, and laughter. Food played an important role too. Barbecue, red soda, and sweet treats symbolized the joy and color of life reclaimed. Red, in particular, came to represent the blood, sacrifice, and resilience of those who had endured. Yet even as Juneteenth grew, it was never just about the past. It was also a reminder of what still needed to be done. Freedom on paper did not mean equality in practice. And many who celebrated that first Juneteenth soon realized that the struggle was far from over. For decades, the holiday lived mostly in the South, passed down through oral tradition. Grandmothers told grandchildren why the 19th of June mattered more than fireworks on the 4th of July. Churches kept the memory alive through sermons, songs, and commemorative services. Even when schools and governments ignored it, communities held on to it because it was theirs. Juneteenth was not about a government decree or an official seal. It was about human perseverance, about the ability to hold on to faith when history had given every reason to let it go. By the early 20th century, migration carried the memory north and west as black families sought better opportunities. They brought Juneteenth with them to Chicago, Los Angeles, and beyond, keeping alive a story too powerful to forget. Each new generation reshaped the meaning of the holiday, connecting the freedom of 1865 to the ongoing pursuit of justice and equality. What began in the dusty streets of Galveston became a national symbol of endurance, a thread that tied together past and present, loss and liberation. In every gathering, whether large or small, the essence of Juneteenth remained the same. It was a celebration of freedom delayed but not denied. It was proof that even when truth is withheld, it will find a way to rise. It was a day that reminded all who heard the story that freedom cannot truly be given, it must be lived, claimed, and defended. For those who danced that day in 1865, freedom was not abstract. It was the sound of footsteps unchained, of families reunited, of laughter echoing where silence once reigned. Juneteenth endures because it tells a story bigger than any single moment. It reminds the world that liberty is not defined by dates or proclamations, but by the courage of those who refuse to stop believing in it. And every June 19th, when songs of joy rise once again under the summer sky, they carry with them the same unbreakable truth that was first spoken in Galveston, that freedom, once awakened, can never again be silenced. Freedom had come, but equality was still a distant dream for the newly freed men and women of Texas and across the South. June 19th, 1860, had marked the beginning of liberation, but not the end of hardship. The chains were gone, yet a different kind of bondage emerged, one built not from iron, but from law, fear, and deceit. As the celebrations of Juneteenth faded into the months that followed, the reality of freedom revealed itself as both a promise and a struggle. Many plantation owners, unwilling to accept the loss of their control, sought new ways to maintain their power. Local authorities, resentful of change, wrote new laws that echoed the cruelty of the old world. These were the Black Code's rules that sought to keep the freed people in their place, turning freedom into a fragile illusion. The codes made it nearly impossible to live freely. They required proof of employment at all times, turning unemployment into a punishable offense. A freed person caught without a labor contract could be arrested and forced to work without pay once more. Some were bound to the same plantations from which they had just been freed, told that this was the only way to survive. It was slavery reborn under another name. The same fields still demanded their sweat, and the same men still profited from their toil. Yet despite this betrayal of justice, the freed people refused to let despair define them. They understood that real freedom, the kind that could not be taken away, would have to be built by their own hands. And so, they began again. Across Texas, small communities known as freedmen's towns began to rise. They were often carved out of unwanted land, rough, isolated, and neglected, but to those who built them, they were sacred ground. Each cabin erected, each garden planted, was an act of quiet defiance against the world that had once owned them. Churches stood at the center of these settlements, serving not only as places of worship but as schools, meeting halls, and safe havens. In those humble wooden structures, lessons were taught that no one could unteach: how to read, how to write, how to dream. For the first time, mothers and fathers could tell their children that learning was a right, not a privilege reserved for others. Education became a revolution of its own. Freed people of all ages crowded into makeshift classrooms, their fingers tracing letters on slates and scraps of paper. Many teachers came from the North, missionaries and abolitionists who risked violence to bring knowledge where it was most feared. But much of the teaching was done by those who had once been denied that very gift. People who learned one letter at a time and passed it on with pride. Each word learned, each sentence written, was a strike against the old order. They understood that education was power, and power was the only path to true freedom. Churches became more than sanctuaries. They became the backbone of the black community. Within their walls, sermons spoke not only of salvation but of self-determination. Hymns were sung with voices full of resolve, songs that carried the memory of bondage, but also the promise of a better world. These were places where leaders were born, where communities planned their futures, where dignity was restored. From these roots grew a new kind of strength, the strength to organize, to resist, and to hope. Despite the oppressive laws and the ever-present threat of violence, progress bloomed in unexpected places. Freed families bought land when they could, pooling their resources to escape the grip of sharecropping and debt. Some became business owners, artisans, and preachers. Others found work in towns, helping to build the very railroads and infrastructure that symbolized America's renewal. Everywhere, the echoes of Juneteenth could still be felt, a stubborn reminder that freedom, though imperfect, was alive. It might bend under the weight of injustice, but it would not break. The contrast between promise and reality was painful. The ideals written in the nation's founding documents spoke of liberty and equality. Yet the lived experience of the freed people was far from either. The same society that had enslaved them now sought to control their labor, restrict their movement, and silence their voices. But what their oppressors failed to understand was that something had changed irrevocably. The spirit that had celebrated that first Juneteenth could not be chained again. Freedom had taken root in their hearts, and no law could uproot it. Generations later, the descendants of those first freed people would look back on those years as the foundation of everything that came after the struggle. The triumphs, and the unyielding belief that equality was not a gift to be granted, but a right to be claimed. Juneteenth was not only about the moment freedom was declared. It was about what came next, the courage to turn that declaration into a way of life. Though the road ahead was long and often cruel, those who lived through those first years of uncertain freedom left behind something extraordinary, a legacy of resilience. They had taken the ashes of oppression and built a future from them. Brick by brick, song, prayer by prayer, their lives told a story the world could not ignore, that even when freedom came late, it was still worth fighting for, protecting, and passing on. And so, every Juneteenth, when their descendants gather to celebrate, they do more than remember a date. They honor a people who refused to surrender, who turned broken promises into new beginnings, and who taught the world that freedom, once awakened, must always find a way to endure. As the decades rolled on, freedom's promise was tested again and again. The years following Reconstruction saw the rise of new barriers, laws, customs, and unwritten rules that sought to divide what history had already tried to mend. This was the era of Jim Crow, when segregation hardened across the South and the ideals of liberty and equality seemed to fade behind a curtain of injustice. For the descendants of those who had first celebrated Juneteenth, it was a painful reminder that freedom, once won, could still be strangled by fear and prejudice. Yet even in those years of tightening control, when laws dictated where one could live, learn, or worship, the spirit of Juneteenth refused to die. Public spaces that had once held Juneteenth parades were closed to black citizens. City parks were off limits, and local ordinances made large gatherings nearly impossible. In many towns, officials labeled the celebration disruptive or unnecessary, erasing its meaning from public life. But the people who had carried the memory of that first day of freedom in their hearts knew better. If they could not celebrate openly, they would celebrate quietly. If they could not raise flags in the streets, they would raise their voices in prayer halls and backyards. The story of Juneteenth had never needed permission. It had always been a story of endurance, passed from one generation to the next like a sacred inheritance. Churches once again became the guardians of the tradition. Behind stained glass windows and beneath wooden rafters, families gathered after Sunday service to remember the day their ancestors had first heard the words, "All slaves are free." The sermons spoke of liberation not just as a moment in history, but as a divine truth that no law could erase. Old hymns filled the air. Songs of deliverance that had once been whispered under the stars of Texas fields now rose boldly in defiance of the silence imposed by segregation. Children learned the meaning of Juneteenth from their elders, not through textbooks, but through stories told with trembling voices and unwavering pride. In those secret gatherings, food became a language of its own. Tables were laid with red punch, roasted meats, and sweet pies, a continuation of the old symbols of resilience and joy. Neighbors shared what little they had, and laughter mingled with tears as elders spoke of freedom's cost. They remembered the soldiers who had brought the news to Galveston, the prayers that had been whispered on that first Juneteenth morning, and the countless souls who had never lived to see it. Even as segregation tried to silence their past, they found ways to keep it alive in every song, every meal, every whispered thank you spoken before eating. Many families celebrated Juneteenth in rural fields far from the watchful eyes of those who might object. They gathered by rivers, under shade trees, or in abandoned clearings, choosing places where they could be together without fear of intrusion. For some, these celebrations were acts of quiet rebellion. For others, they were moments of healing. Parents taught their children to honor the day, not just for what it represented, but for what it demanded to continue striving, to keep walking toward a future their ancestors had only dreamed of. Over time, the celebrations themselves evolved into symbols of perseverance. In the early 20th century, as the Great Migration began, thousands of black families left the South in search of work and dignity in northern cities. They carried Juneteenth with them, tucked into memory like a treasured heirloom. Even when employers refused to give time off for the day, people found ways to gather after work, hosting modest celebrations in small community halls or backyards. It did not matter that the parades were smaller or that newspapers ignored them. The meaning remained the same. Juneteenth was not defined by scale, it was defined by spirit. In cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Oakland, the tradition began to spread anew. Freed from some of the harshest restrictions of the South, these migrants revived old customs and gave them new form. Churches in northern neighborhoods organized festivals. Choirs performed songs of faith and freedom, and elders told the old stories with renewed pride. For those who had fled the segregation of the South, Juneteenth became not just a remembrance, but a bridge connecting the world they had escaped to the one they hoped to build. Still, throughout the Jim Crow years, Juneteenth lived in the margins. Schools did not teach it. History books ignored it. The nation celebrated its independence every 4th of July. But few spoke of the day when freedom had finally reached all Americans. Yet in living rooms and church basements, on porches and in cotton fields, the memory endured. It was carried in the songs of gospel choirs, in the quiet faith of mothers lighting candles, in the laughter of children who did not yet know the full weight of the history being handed to them. The beauty of Juneteenth during those years was not found in grand parades or public speeches, but in its survival itself, against every attempt to erase it. The holiday remained a living act of remembrance and resistance. It reminded those who celebrated that freedom is not guaranteed by governments, but preserved by people who refuse to forget. Each gathering, however small, became a promise that the story would continue. And it did, though the decades of segregation sought to divide. Juneteenth became the thread that bound generations together. It spoke to a truth deeper than law, deeper than politics, the truth that dignity and freedom cannot be legislated away. And when, many years later, the world would finally rediscover the day and honor it once more, it would be because of those families who kept the flame alive in the darkest times, who whispered the story when they could not shout it, and who never stopped believing that the freedom declared in Galveston was meant for all. And forever, for more than 1.5 centuries, Juneteenth endured as a whispered story, a family memory, a community celebration kept alive by those who refused to let the truth of freedom fade. From the dusty roads of Galveston to the crowded streets of northern cities, the meaning of that day lived in the hearts of millions. It carried through years of segregation, through the civil rights movement, through generations who marched, sang, and prayed for the America that freedom had promised but not yet delivered. And then, in June 2021, after 156 years of persistence, Juneteenth finally became recognized as a U.S. federal holiday not only for Black Americans, but for every American who believes that liberty must include all. When President Biden signed the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act into law, the moment resonated far beyond the walls of the White House. It was more than a symbolic gesture, it was the acknowledgement of a truth that had waited too long to be spoken aloud. That the story of America's freedom was incomplete until everyone shared in it. The day was not born in Congress or written by the powerful. It had been shaped by ordinary people, by mothers and fathers who had passed down memories of that first celebration in 1865. By preachers who spoke of hope even when it seemed lost. By teachers who taught children that history must be remembered to be redeemed. For those who had always honored Juneteenth, the new recognition was bittersweet. It was a triumph, yes, but also a reminder of how long it had taken. The nation that prided itself on liberty had taken more than 1.5 centuries to officially recognize the day its own citizens were truly freed. Yet even in that delay, there was meaning. It proved that truth, no matter how long it is ignored, has a way of rising, just as the people of Texas once learned that freedom could not be hidden forever. The United States as a whole came to understand that justice delayed is still justice possible if there are enough voices willing to fight for it. Today, Juneteenth stands not only as a commemoration of the past, but as a mirror reflecting the present. It reminds us that freedom is not a destination. It is a living promise that must be renewed with every generation. It challenges us to ask, what does freedom truly mean if inequality still exists in our schools, our neighborhoods, and our systems? It calls on everyone regardless of race, background, or belief to remember that liberty cannot be selective. The joy of Juneteenth lies not just in celebrating emancipation, but in continuing the work it began. The pursuit of a world where every person is treated with dignity, fairness, and respect. Every June 19th, communities across the nation gather once again in parks, churches, and city squares just as their ancestors did more than a century ago. They eat, dance, and sing under the summer sky. Children run between tables draped in red, black, and green. Elders tell stories of struggle and survival. Musicians fill the air with songs of pride and perseverance. And in every voice, there is a quiet echo of General Granger's proclamation, "All slaves are free," words that once changed everything. But now those words hold an even deeper meaning. They remind us that freedom delayed is not freedom denied, and that the human spirit, once awakened, will always reach for the light. Juneteenth is not just a black holiday, it is an American one. It tells the story of a nation that has stumbled, fallen, and yet continues to rise toward the ideals it first promised. It invites everyone regardless of heritage to celebrate not only the victories of the past, but also the possibilities of the future. It teaches that freedom is not a privilege granted by those in power, but a birthright that belongs to every soul. As we close this journey through history, let us remember that the spirit of Juneteenth is not confined to a single date on the calendar. It lives in every act of kindness, every effort to right a wrong, every voice that speaks truth to power. It lives in the courage of those who still believe that justice, though slow, will come. Thank you for joining me in revisiting this powerful story, a story of pain, perseverance, and, ultimately, triumph. If this journey moved you, if it made you reflect on what freedom truly means, I invite you to help keep these stories alive. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who believe in the power of truth and history. Because remembering is not just about honoring the past, it is about shaping the future. And as Juneteenth teaches us, freedom is never complete until it belongs to everyone.